There were maybe 30 people in that lobby when it happened, and not one of them knew what they were watching. They saw a garbage man set down his collection bag on the marble floor of a Manhattan luxury tower and walk toward a little girl who was sitting alone on a bench by the window with her knees pulled to her chest and her eyes fixed on something outside that none of us could see. They saw him sit down beside her, not close, not crowding, just near. They saw his hands move, one slow, deliberate gesture, and they saw the girl go still in a way that was completely different from the stillness she had been holding for 2 years. They saw her turn her head and look at him, and then they saw her small hands rise from her knees and sign back. One word, and the woman standing 20 feet away in a cashmere coat with a phone in each hand and the weight of an empire on her shoulders made a sound I have never heard another human being make before or since. Not a cry exactly, something underneath a cry. The sound of a door opening that everyone had decided was locked forever. I am going to tell you what word I signed to that little girl. But first I need to tell you about my daughter, because you cannot understand that lobby without her, and you cannot understand her without understanding what it cost me to learn the only language that actually reached her, and what it gave me back in return. If you have ever loved somebody in a silence so complete that you had to learn an entirely new way to speak just to find them inside it, this channel is for you. Hit subscribe right now, because every story I tell here is for the people who went to the lengths the world told them were too far and found out the world was wrong. I'll wait. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I'm 51 years old. I drive a collection truck for the city of New York, Sanitation District 7, Lower Manhattan route, which I have been driving for 19 years. I am a large man, 6'2", 230 pounds, with hands that are not delicate and a face that does not invite small talk. People do not look at me when I am working. They look past me the way you look past a mailbox or a fire hydrant, necessary, expected, invisible. I made peace with that a long time ago. Invisibility has its own kind of freedom, and I have had 19 years to learn its uses. I am a single father. My daughter's name is Nadia. She is 24 years old now, grown, living her own life, building the things she is going to build, and she is the entire reason I am standing here telling you this story. Nadia's mother and I separated when Nadia was 4. There was no villain in it. Two people who loved each other found out that love was not the only ingredient and parted with as much grace as two tired people can manage. Her mother is a good woman who lives in Queens and sees Nadia regularly and loves her completely. But from age 4 onward, the daily work of raising Nadia fell mostly to me. And that arrangement, which was born out of circumstance, turned out to be the defining fact of my life. Nadia was born with bilateral sensorineural hearing loss. Profound, meaning she hears essentially nothing in either ear without amplification. And even with hearing aids, the world reaches her only partially, like a radio station caught between frequencies. They're but distorted, present but not clear. She was diagnosed at 8 months old. I was 27 years old sitting in a pediatric audiologist's office on a plastic chair that was too small for me, holding my daughter, who was wearing a paper gown and trained to eat my thumb, while a doctor explained in careful, compassionate language what her audiogram meant and what our options were, and what the research said about early intervention outcomes. I nodded through all of it. I said the right things. I drove home. I sat in the parking lot of our apartment building for 45 minutes because I did not want Nadia to see my face until I had it under control. I was not grieving her. I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not sitting in that parking lot mourning my daughter. I was sitting there mourning my own ignorance, the enormous gap between what she was going to need and what I currently knew how to give her. I was a 27-year-old garbage man with a high school diploma and hands built for physical work, and my daughter was going to live in a world of silence that I did not speak one word of. That was what I was sitting with, not her limitation, my own. I started learning American Sign Language the following Monday, not with any plan or program at first. I found a library book. I checked it out along with 2 others on deaf education and early language development in children with hearing loss. I read all 3 in the first week. I went back and got more. I found a community ASL class that met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at a church in Hoboken. I went. I was the only student in that class who was not there because a family member had recently lost their hearing. I was the only one who had never seen anyone sign before I walked through that door. I was the worst student in the room by a considerable margin for the first 4 months. My hands, which can replace a truck axle and carry a 200-pound collection bin, are not naturally instruments of precision. The subtleties of hand shape and orientation and movement that distinguish one sign from another were things my fingers had to learn the way a child learns to write, by making the wrong shape 1,000 times before the right shape starts to feel natural. I practiced in the truck cab between stops. I practiced in the mirror every morning before Nadia woke up. I made flashcards and taped them to the kitchen cabinets. I found a deaf community center in Lower Manhattan and showed up at their open events and stood in rooms full of people who communicated with their hands and watched and tried to follow and made mistakes and was corrected kindly and came back the following week. I want to be honest about how hard it was and how long it took because I think that part matters. There was no moment of sudden fluency. There was no breakthrough morning when I woke up and the language had settled into my hands. There were years of feeling clumsy and slow and humbled, years of Nadia watching my hands with the patient expression of a child who loves you and is waiting for you to get something that is just beyond your reach, years of small progress and long plateaus and the particular specific frustration of knowing exactly what you want to say and not yet having the hands to say it. Those years were not wasted. Those years were the whole point. Because the thing you build through that kind of sustained effort is not just vocabulary. It is a relationship with difficulty itself. You learn. When you are a large man with a collection route who is sitting in a church basement on a Tuesday night trying to learn to say mother and father and please and thank you with your hands, that the distance between not knowing something and knowing it is always crossable if you are willing to stay uncomfortable long enough to cross it. That is not a small lesson. That is the most important lesson. I learned it for Nadia. It served me for 20 years afterward in ways I never anticipated. Nadia's hearing aids helped her navigate the hearing world with effort. ASL gave us a world that was entirely hers, entirely ours, where nothing needed to be turned up or strained toward or imperfectly caught. In our kitchen, in our language, my daughter was never hard of hearing. She was just Nadia, and I was just her father. And the language between us was not a workaround or an accommodation. It was ours. It was what we built together out of a library book and a church basement class, and 20 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, and 1,000 small conversations at a kitchen table in the Bronx. I would not trade 1 minute of it for a version of my life where she had been born hearing. Not because I am sentimental about difficulty, because the version of myself that learned to sign for Nadia is a better man than the version of me that would have existed without that necessity. She made me better in the direction of her need. That is what children do when you are paying attention. I want to tell you something about what learning sign language did to me that had nothing to do with Nadia, because I think it is the part of this story that most people miss. Learning to communicate in a visual language, a language built entirely of gesture and expression, and the precise positioning of hands in space, changed the way I saw every room I walked into. When you speak with your hands, you learn to read faces with a completeness that most hearing people never develop, because in sign language the face is not decoration, it is grammar. Eyebrow position, mouth shape, the direction of the gaze, all of it carries meaning as essential as the words themselves. You cannot sign fluently without being completely, constantly present in the face of the person you are talking to. And you cannot receive sign language without doing the same in return. Eye contact is not optional. Presence is not optional. In our house, you could not be somewhere else in your head while talking to Nadia. She would have known immediately because her eyes were on you the entire time, reading everything. What this meant in practice was that Nadia taught me, over the years of her childhood, to be more fully present in a conversation than I had ever been in my adult life. I had spent my first 27 years moving through the world the way most men who do physical work move through it, efficiently, purposefully, with my attention on the task in front of me and not on the texture of the room around me. Nadia changed that, because with Nadia there was no such thing as a background. Everything was foreground. Every flicker of her expression was information. Every shift in her posture was a sentence. I had to train myself to receive all of it, not just the parts that were directed at me, not just the obvious signals, but the entire field of her communication, which was always richer and more layered than most hearing people's speech, because she had learned, the way deaf children learn, to put everything she could not say in her hands and face, and the angle of her shoulders. You watch a child communicate like that for 20 years, and it changes your nervous system. You start receiving the world differently. You start noticing the things that are being said without words in every room you enter. And what that meant in a wider sense was that I became, without planning to, a man who reads rooms, who reads people, who notices the thing that is actually happening underneath the thing that appears to be happening. I noticed it on my route. I noticed which building supers were genuinely managing their stress and which ones were one bad week away from falling apart. I noticed which doormen were sleeping poorly. I noticed which residents, usually the ones in the most expensive apartments, had the most brittle composure, the kind that holds until it doesn't. I noticed the children especially, children who are collected from school by nannies who are on their phones, children who are handed over at building entrances with the careful neutrality of a transaction, children who are present in every expensive way and alone in the way that actually counts. These are not the things a garbage man is supposed to notice, but I noticed them. Nadia taught me to, and the noticing, it turns out, was the whole thing. The noticing was the skill that built itself over 20 years inside a kitchen in the Bronx, and then walked out one February morning into a marble lobby in Manhattan and sat down beside a little girl who had not spoken to anyone in 8 months. You cannot plan that. You can only build something real and trust that real things find their use. The building at 220 Central Park West is a pre-war residential tower with a limestone facade, and a lobby that costs more per square foot than my entire apartment. I collect from 6 buildings on that block as part of my route. I have been collecting from 220 Central Park West for 11 years. The building has a doorman named Patrick who has worked there for 22 years and who makes good coffee and keeps a photograph of his grandchildren behind the security desk. The building has 34 floors, 42 units, and in the penthouse duplex on 33 and 34, it has a resident named Carolyn Voss. I knew Carolyn Voss the way I know most of my building contacts, by name and by the occasional early morning exchange, when she was leaving for whatever a woman like that leaves for in the mornings. She was 44 years old, the founder and CEO of a technology company whose name you would recognize immediately. The kind of company that became so embedded in daily life that people stopped thinking of it as a company and started thinking of it as weather. She had a reputation in the building as someone who was demanding but not unkind, who tipped generously at Christmas, who greeted the staff by name because she had made a point of learning them, which I always respected. She was also, as I learned in pieces over years, a single mother. She had a daughter named Iris. Iris was 8 years old, profoundly deaf from birth, and for the last 2 years she had stopped communicating with almost everyone. The silence, I gathered from Patrick and from the fragments you absorb working a building route over years, had started after the departure of Iris's primary sign language interpreter, a woman named Susan who had worked with the family for 4 years and who had left suddenly when her own family circumstances required her to relocate. Iris had other interpreters after Susan. Carolyn had hired the best available, spared nothing. But something had closed in Iris after Susan left that no amount of money or expertise had managed to reopen. She stopped signing with the new interpreters. She stopped signing at school. She retreated into herself the way children sometimes do when they have trusted the world with something fragile and had it dropped, not cruelly, not intentionally, but dropped nonetheless, and have decided that the cost of trusting again is more than they currently have available to spend. Carolyn had, by the time this story reaches its center, consulted 4 deaf education specialists, 3 child psychologists, 2 family therapists who specialized in childhood trauma and attachment, and a researcher from Gallaudet University who was considered among the foremost experts in deaf children's social withdrawal. None of them had gotten a sign out of Iris in 8 months. I knew none of this detail at the time. What I knew was what I could see when I occasionally glimpsed Iris in the lobby, a small girl with her mother's eyes, and a stillness around her that was not the stillness of contentment. I recognized it the way you recognize something you have seen before without knowing exactly where. It sat in my mind the way a sound sits in your ears after the source of it has gone quiet. The morning it happened was a Thursday in February, 6th week of the new year, 6:45 in the morning, still fully dark outside. The kind of New York winter morning where the cold has a specific texture to it, dry and immediate, the kind that clears your head whether you want it cleared or not. I was making my collection pickup at 220, which meant I was in the lobby for about 3 minutes while Patrick called down to have the service bins rolled out. I had been on the route since 4:30. I had 3 more buildings on the block after this one. I was thinking about the bins and about a repair on the truck that was due Friday, and about whether Nadia had mentioned she was coming for dinner this week or next. These are the thoughts a man has on a collection route at 6:45 in February. The ordinary machinery of an ordinary morning. Carolyn Voss came out of the elevator with Iris beside her. She was on her phone, the way she usually was at that hour, talking in the quick, decisive shorthand of someone managing multiple problems simultaneously. The kind of conversation that happens between a person and their device before the sun is fully up, and that would be incomprehensible to anyone who overheard it. Iris was in her school coat and her backpack, standing beside her mother with her hands in her pockets and her eyes on the floor. I had my collection bag over my shoulder. I nodded at Patrick, and then I looked at Iris. She was standing in a lobby that was warm and beautifully lit and full of everything money could provide for a child's morning, and she looked like someone who had been alone for a very long time. Not sad exactly. Something more specific than sad, the particular quality of a person who has stopped expecting the room to offer them anything they can use. I have stood in that exact condition myself. Not in a lobby like that one, not with those resources around me. But the condition itself is not a function of what surrounds you. It is a function of whether anyone in your immediate world is speaking your language. And I could see, from the way her hands were buried in her pockets and her eyes were fixed on a point on the marble floor, that nobody in Iris's morning was speaking her language. Nobody in Iris's morning had been speaking her language for a very long time. I set my collection bag down on the marble. I walked over to the bench by the window, the one near the potted ficus that the building decorates differently every season. I sat down, not beside her yet, a few feet away, at the far end of the bench. I did not look directly at her. I looked at the street outside the way she had been looking at the floor, giving her the same gift Nadia taught me to give, the gift of shared direction, the signal that I am not here to make a demand of you. I am just here, in the same space, looking at the same world, not requiring anything from you in return. This is the first thing you learn when you live with a child who communicates differently than the world around them. You learn that presence without demand is the rarest and most valuable thing you can offer. Not presence with a goal, not presence with a program, not presence with a quiet hope that this will be the moment they open up. Just presence, available, unhurried, with no particular outcome in mind. I felt rather than saw her attention shift toward me. The slight change in the quality of the air when a child who has been deliberately not looking starts to consider looking. I waited. Patrick had gone to the service entrance. Carolyn was still on her phone near the elevator bank, turned slightly away, the phone pressed to her ear with the focused posture of someone in the middle of something that cannot be paused. It was quiet in the lobby the way lobbies are quiet at that hour, the sound of the city muffled by thick glass and good construction, the particular morning hush of a building that has not yet fully woken up. And then I turned my head toward Iris. She was looking at me, not the way she had been looking at the floor, actually looking with the full weight of her attention, the way deaf children look when they are reading a room, comprehensively, carefully, missing nothing. Her eyes had the specific quality that Nadia's eyes had when she was deciding whether to trust a room, measuring something. The private calculation of whether the risk of reaching is worth what it might cost. I held her gaze for a moment, steady and unhurried the way you hold a door you want to stay open without pushing it wider than it is ready to go. And then I lifted my right hand and I signed to her. One word. Slowly, clearly, the way you sign to a child who you are not sure has her eyes quite ready. The sign for hello in American Sign Language is a simple thing. You bring your flat hand to your forehead like a casual salute, and then move it outward and slightly down. It is not a complicated gesture. You could learn it in 30 seconds, but I did not sign it the way a stranger signs a word they have looked up in an app between meetings. I signed it the way Nadia had taught me to sign everything, with my whole face present, with my eyes saying the same thing my hand was saying, which was simply, I see you. I am not asking anything of you. I am not a specialist or a program or an intervention. I am just a person who knows this language and is saying hello in it because you are here and I am here and hello seems like the right thing. And Iris went completely still. Not the old stillness, the defended, inward stillness of someone who has withdrawn from the room, a different stillness. The kind that happens when something unexpected crosses the distance between one person and another and arrives intact. She looked at my hand. She looked at my face. And then, after a moment that lasted long enough for me to feel my own heart beat twice, she raised her small hands from her lap and she signed back. Hello. One word. The first word anyone had gotten from Iris in 8 months. I signed back. She signed again. We were 3 exchanges in before Carolyn Voss came off her phone call. I heard her stop mid-step behind me. I did not turn around. I kept my eyes on Iris, because the conversation was Iris's and she had paid a very high price to start it, and I was not going to let anything interrupt it before she was ready. We signed for about 4 more minutes. Not complicated things. The way you talk to a child who has just decided to trust you, small things, real things, what she could see outside the window, whether she liked the ficus, whether she thought it looked like a real tree or a pretend one. She signed that it looked like a pretend one trying to be real. I signed that I thought so too, but that I respected the effort. She almost smiled. Almost. Carolyn Voss was standing very still behind us and not speaking. I could feel that she understood something important was happening and had the extraordinary discipline not to interrupt it, which told me more about her than any reputation ever had. When Iris eventually looked past me toward her mother, it was on her own terms in her own time, and she signed something to her mother, something simple. I could not see Carolyn's face in that moment, but I could see her reflection in the window glass, and what I saw there was a woman coming apart at a depth that had nothing to do with the composed executive the building knew. She did not know sign language. She had interpreters for that purpose, but she knew what the movement of her daughter's hands meant the way any mother knows the shape of her child reaching toward her. She crossed the lobby in about 4 steps, and she crouched down to Iris's level, and she held her daughter's face in both hands and said something softly, and Iris signed something back. And I stood up quietly and picked up my collection bag and walked to the service entrance to finish my pickup. Patrick was there with the bins. He looked at my face and said nothing, which told me he was a man who understood the value of certain silences. I finished the block. I drove the route. I did not see Carolyn Voss again that day. She found me the following Thursday, same time, same lobby. She was not on her phone. She was standing near the elevator in her coat waiting for me. Patrick looked at me when I came through the service entrance and gave me a small nod that meant she had been there for 15 minutes. She waited while I made the collection exchange. And then she walked over. She was a woman who had built a company that operated in 40 countries, and she was looking at me the way people look at things that have reorganized their understanding of how the world works. She said she wanted to know who I was. Not what I did. Who I was, so I told her. I told her about Nadia, about the library books and the church basement class in Hoboken and the Deaf Community Center, and 11 years of Tuesday and Thursday evenings, turning my construction worker hands into instruments that could hold a conversation. I told her about the parking lot outside our apartment building when Nadia was 8 months old and what I had been sitting with in that car. She listened without interrupting. The whole time. When I was done, she said, "She made you into someone who could reach my daughter." I said, "She made me into someone who bothered to learn her language. That is the whole of it. That is all I did in your lobby. I spoke her language." Carolyn looked at me for a long moment, and then she made me an offer. She said she wanted me to work with Iris, not as a therapist, not as a specialist, just as someone who would show up and sign and not make a project out of it. She named a figure. It was substantial. It was more money than I would earn driving the truck in 2 years. I told her no. She looked at what she must have expected was the beginning of a negotiation. It was not. I told her that what had happened in the lobby was not a service. It was just one person who knows a language finding another person who speaks it and saying hello. You cannot put a fee on that without making it into something it isn't. What I told her instead was this: Iris does not need me. Iris needs you to learn. Not perfectly, not fluently, not in a year. But she needs to see you trying the way Nadia needed to see me trying, sitting at a kitchen table with a library book and hands that kept making the wrong shape, but showing up every day to make them again. A child does not need you to be fluent. A child needs to see that you love them enough to try. That is the thing no specialist can give her. Only you can give her that. She enrolled in a beginner ASL class the following week. I know because Patrick told me, and because 3 months later when I came through the lobby on a Thursday morning, Iris was sitting on the bench by the ficus again, and this time her hands were in her lap and not in her pockets, and when she saw me she signed good morning without any hesitation at all. And beside her, Carolyn Voss, CEO of a company with operations in 40 countries, signed good morning back to her daughter, imperfectly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who is still learning, but she signed it. And Iris watched her mother's hands, and her expression did something that I do not have adequate words for, because some things exist on the other side of language, and you just have to be there to receive them. I signed good morning to both of them and went to do my pickup. I have thought about that morning many times since. I have thought about the gap between what money can buy and what love can do when it is willing to become inconvenient. Carolyn Voss could have hired every ASL expert on the Eastern Seaboard, and she did. And none of it reached Iris, because expertise is not the same as presence and credentials are not the same as commitment. What reached Iris was a man with calloused hands who had spent 20 years learning to speak silence because his daughter lived inside it, who walked over to a bench in a lobby and signed one word with his whole face and none of his agenda. And what kept Iris was a mother who was willing to sit down in the discomfort of being a beginner for the sake of her child. These are not things money purchases. These are things love does when it decides to stop being comfortable. Nadia called me the evening after the Thursday morning with Iris and Carolyn. She calls most evenings. We sign over video, the way we have been doing since she got her first phone, and figured out that video calls were the phone she had always deserved. She could tell something had happened. She asked me. I told her the story. She was quiet for a moment on the screen in the specific way she gets quiet when something has landed somewhere real inside her. And then she signed to me the 4 words that I want to leave you with because they are the truest thing I know. She signed, "You gave her mine." I sat with that for a long time after the call ended. My daughter, who I learned an entire language for, who taught me everything I know about being present in a silence, was telling me that what I had given that little girl in a marble lobby on a February morning was the thing Nadia herself had once needed most. To be seen in the language she actually lived in. To have someone show up in her world instead of always asking her to show up in theirs. I did not give Iris anything that Nadia did not first give me. I just carried it forward the way love always moves when it has somewhere to go. I think about that chain sometimes. The 19-year-old audiologist who diagnosed Nadia with such careful compassion that I left her office knowing what I needed to do even through the grief of finding out. The woman at the church in Hoboken who ran that Tuesday and Thursday class for 12 years and never once made the garbage man in the back row feel like he did not belong there. The people at the Deaf Community Center who let a hearing man stand in their rooms and learn and corrected him without condescension and welcomed him back week after week. All of those people were links in a chain that ended in a marble lobby in February with a little girl raising her hands for the first time in 8 months. None of them knew they were in the chain. None of them could have predicted where it led. They just did their work honestly and well, and the work went looking for where it was needed. That is the thing about real skills built for real love. They do not stay contained. They travel. They find the children who need them. They show up in lobbies at 6:45 in the morning in February, when a garbage man sets down his collection bag and walks toward a bench by a window, because something in his body recognizes a silence he has spent 20 years learning to speak. Before you go, I want to ask you one thing, because it is the question that matters more than anything else I could say. Is there someone in your life who is living in a language you have not yet bothered to learn? Not sign language necessarily. The language of the person who goes quiet in every group conversation. The language of the child who draws instead of talks. The language of the parent who shows love in actions because words were never safe in the house they grew up in. Everyone around you is speaking a language. Most of us are only fluent in our own. The people who reach the ones the world calls unreachable are almost never the ones with the most credentials. They are the ones who loved someone enough to sit down in a church basement on a Tuesday night and learn to make a new shape with their hands. Tell me in the comments. Tell me about the person in your life who learned your language when they did not have to. Or tell me about the one whose language you have not learned yet and are maybe thinking about starting. I read every single comment and I would be honored to know. Hit subscribe if you have not yet. Leave a like so this reaches the person who needs it tonight. And I will see you in the next one.